All right. Welcome to the final day of the program. Our first speaker today will be Abhishek Dhar, and he'll tell us about multiple attractors in an anharmonic chain.
Okay, people can hear me. Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Prasanna. So first, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to this very nice meeting, and also thanks to the people who are still there. Okay, so this is I will talk about a driven system and periodically driven system, and it's, I think, pretty complex. So it fits with the topic. So this is work done with my PhD student Umesh, one visiting student Simant and Anupam. I think Umesh and Anupam are there in the audience. Okay, so this is the sort of the motivation for the work. So this is a paper on observation of a dissipative phase transition in one-dimensional circuit QD lattice. So what you see is an array of a one-dimensional array of qubits which are coupled to some cavities, and so there are, I think, around 70 resonators. So it looks like this if you open it up. And so each cavity has a qubit, and then what you do is you send light at one end and look at the output at the other end. Okay, and what you can change here is the frequency and the amplitude of the light that you are sending in, and you look at the output amplitude. Okay, so what is observed experimentally is that as you change the frequency and drive power, then the output is given here. So this is the transmission ST1, and you find that beyond at any frequency, over a range of frequencies, beyond some driving power, there's a sort of transition. Okay, so so this is a very low transmission, and this is high transmission. So suddenly, beyond some frequencies, the transmission falls drastically. Okay, so this system, I mean, so effectively, what you can think of it is the qubits sort of induce some interaction between the phonon modes. So you can sort of effectively think of this as a model with interacting photons. Okay, so the sort of the simplest model, so people have written, so there was a paper after this experimental paper, where they basically wrote this model for this system. So it's a 1D Bose-Hubbard model, where you have some interaction, some hopping, and then you have some drive at the ends. Okay, so basically you are periodically driving at this end, and then you have some dissipation at both ends, right? And then what you want to look at is what is the transmission at this end. So you are sending light from this end and looking at the transmission at this end. So this is a model of interacting photons. And in this paper, what then they did is they did an analysis of sort of a, so you can of course write a Lindblad equation at trying to do something with these paths and so on. But they did a sort of semi-classical analysis of the mean fields of these various amplitudes. And they sort of saw some of the signatures that were seen in the experiment of this sharp transition. Okay, so so the model I will talk about is not exactly this. So there was a further paper by these people, Vinav Prem, Virbil Chandani, and Shivaji Sondi, where they again looked at a slightly different model, again trying to understand the same sort of setup. Again, it's a completely classical model, and so this is the model. Okay, so okay, so it's a so I have the model here. So it's a one-dimensional chain. So inside you have some on-site potential, which is there's a quadratic part and a quartic part, and the interparticle interaction is just harmonic. Okay. And then at one end you drive it with some sinusoidal force, and then you have some dissipation, and you could have thermal noise. So in this paper they did not have thermal noise, but in principle you could have both dissipation and noise. At the right end, you just have dissipation, and again, it's you could put in noise. In this paper, they didn't have noise, So they just had dissipation at this end, and at this end you have driving and some dissipation. Okay, and inside it's completely Hamiltonian dynamics. Okay, so now I mean, what does one expect? Okay, so first of all, these are the equations. I hope this is clear. And so in this, the only sort of dimensionless control parameters that are important are the force and omega d. And you could have one more parameter, but here we'll set all these other parameters to just one. Okay. So, so this is, if you ignore the anharmonicity, then there's a band of allowed modes, which is given by this spectrum. Okay, so first of all, this model, the Klein-Gordon chain, it has no momentum conservation. And this is actually, if you didn't have drive and all, this is one of the simplest model where you can see Fourier heat transmission. And so you get diffusive heat transport. I mean, so there are, you can test lots of things, and it's completely consistent with this diffusion equation. Okay, so this review that we wrote some time back. Okay, so now what you might expect is that if you're driving at one end with some force and there's some damping, maybe this should give like some effective temperature at this end, and so it should more or less. And inside we know that there's diffusive heat transport. So it should, there's some expectation that one can have like, finally it's just some effective temperature, right, at one end, and you are at the other end it's a cold bath at 0 temperature, and at this end you have some finite temperature. And then you should expect Fourier transmission. Okay, so, okay, so in this case, of course, we don't put any noise in this paper. And and then you look at the non-equilibrium steady state. Okay, so you drive the system and you look at long times. It goes to some steady state. So this is a dynamical system. You expect that it will go to some attractor because there's dissipation and drive. So it should go to some attractor at long times. Okay, and what they found are some very interesting transitions as you change the force F. Okay, so for some time I'll just talk about this paper, and then I'll also talk about another sort of relevant paper, and then I'll talk what we have done. Okay, so this is what they observed. I mean, so you just look at the steady state. In the steady state, you just look at the current through the system. Yeah, question? Okay, no. So it's a periodic drive. So of course, you expect a periodic current, but you look at the time averaged current. And see how this changes with the driving force amplitude. So this was the sort of very interesting observation that as you change the driving force amplitude, the average current, so initially there's a regime where it increases, actually increases quadratically for small force. And this you can just understand as if you just do a harmonic analysis. Okay, so small forces, it gives almost like a harmonic chain, and it increases. And then you find that for over a range of forces, the current stays completely constant. Okay. Okay, so it stays constant, and then at some value of the force, they observed a transition to the current goes down, and then it decays in some way. Okay, so this is the blue curve here is for a system size of n equal to 100. If you do this for n equal to 500, sorry, the green curve is for n equal to 100. If you do it for 500, you find that this flat region goes down, and you get a transition here. For a smaller system, this would go on for a longer time, and then you would get a transition. Okay. So in the thermodynamic limit, this phase doesn't exist. So it's a finite, you see it only for finite systems. And this is, okay, so the observation. Okay, and so they also looked at like what happens if you change the driving frequency. So first of all, this is observed only if the driving frequency is in the band of the harmonic system, right? If it's outside the band, you don't see this. Okay, so at different frequencies, you see that if you increase the frequency, then this transition goes down. If you decrease the frequency, the transition is pushed far further. Okay, so these are the observations. There are two sharp transitions at F1 and F2. And in this regime, what you find is the steady state is a periodic state. Okay, so I'll discuss this a bit, what is the structure of this state that you get here. While out here and out here, it's completely chaotic. Okay, so if you look at the Lyapunov exponent, it's positive here and here. Here it's 0. Okay, so this is a periodic attractor. These are chaotic attractors. Okay, so yeah, so this I already said, in the thermodynamic limit, you don't see, you don't get this flat regime. And also, if you look at in this regime, what is the system size dependence of the current? It's diffusive. While in this regime, it's ballistic. It, of course, doesn't depend on the system size. And out here, there's some anomalous transport. Okay, so now in the periodic regime, the solution can be sort of understood by just trying a solution of this form in plugging into this kind of a solution in the equations of motion and just ignoring higher harmonics. Okay, so then you get a set of equations like this, and at least in the bulk, you see that there's a periodic wave solution of this form. So it's just cos kx minus omega t, and there's an amplitude which is related. If you plug this solution into the bulk equation here, you find that this amplitude is related to the frequency and phase in this way. Okay, so this, I mean, this is very accurate. If you compare with the numerics, this works extremely well. And from this solution, of course, you can compute the steady state current, and this is what you get. So, I mean, here you can see it doesn't depend on the force, and it doesn't depend on system size and so on. Okay, so this is, okay, so this again are all results from this paper. And they also observed that the, if you look at, analyze these equations, then the nonlinear wave equation seems to be, so it seems to be stable for under linear perturbations. Okay, the other sort of interesting observation was, even if you look at large N case where this flat regime goes, but you recover Fourier's law. If you look at the temperature profiles, they across the chain. So this is the position of the oscillator, and this is temperature. You find a very strange profile. So there's a sharp jump at the boundary, and inside. So these are for different system sizes, and you see that. It seems to converge to some profile like it's very flat here, and then there's some gradient in some regime. Okay, and in the flat regime, if you the system is actually again in a very close to periodic state, where if you, for example, so what they measured is the velocity distribution, and you can measure the kurtosis. So in this region, the kurtosis is kind of far from Gaussian, while in this regime it's Gaussian. Okay, so basically the oscillator, it's in a sort of so in, I think these are known as Chimera states. Here it's periodic, while here it's kind of chaotic. Right? Okay, right. So these are the observations in this paper. So the even though you get a current scaling like J goes as 1 by n, the temperature profile that you find here doesn't really follow from Fourier's law. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
This current is period. So what you are plotting is period averaged current or something?
Time average over a time period, right?
But when you say that the steady state is chaotic, then the time period is?
Yeah, then there's no time period, right? I mean, so see, yeah, you would expect you're thinking of the flow case state. Yeah. But yeah, there's no flow case state here.
Okay.
I mean, of course, it's a, I mean, it's yeah, it's because yeah, this will I'll discuss later. But right now, it's purely dynamical system, right? It may not have a like just ordinary differential equations.
And in these ones, they don't even have the noise, right?
Yeah, there's no noise, right? Yeah. So if with noise, then I can think of a Fokker-Planck operator, and I can think of flow case states.
Okay.
But right now, for this system, I wouldn't think of flow case state. Okay, so right. Okay, now let me talk about another paper. Again, very recent paper. This is in Communications in Mathematical Physics 23 by these people. Okay, so here they again looked at a very similar setup where you have a chain, but it's a the model is slightly different. It's a harmonic chain. and it's not completely Hamiltonian. There's some stochastic dynamics. So the stochasticity is that you, at random times, you just flip their momentum. Okay, so it conserves energy but doesn't conserve momentum. And the reason you study this is because this is a model where you can exactly prove that Fourier's law is satisfied, and so you can do a lot of analytic stuff. Okay, but you drive it in the same way at the left end, but what they do is they scale the force in a certain way, and there's no dissipation at the left end. Okay, so here I had dissipation and drive. But in this paper, what they do is they just have a drive, but no dissipation. And the drive, I mean, so you can imagine if there's no dissipation, this might heat up a lot. So to prevent that, they do this particular scaling. And the scaling is kind of sort of makes sense because, okay, so this we'll again discuss later. Okay, so, and at the right boundary, it's very similar. But they have a finite temperature. Okay, so in the earlier paper that I've been discussing, the temperature was 0. But in this paper, they have a finite temperature. At this end, there's only force, no drive, right? And it's a harmonic chain, no anharmonicity. Effectively, the stochastics, I mean, the idea of putting the stochasticity is to model the anharmonicity. It conserves energy, but does not conserve momentum. Okay, so so in this, the main observation was okay. So this is a purely a maths paper full of theorem, lemma, and so there are no plots. But the main conclusion is that Fourier's law is satisfied, and you get a temperature profile, which you can just get from writing the diffusion equation with boundary conditions, slightly mixed boundary conditions with J fixed at one end and the temperature fixed at the other end. Okay, so it's slightly different boundary conditions than we usually encounter. So the forces in this case, what the force is doing, it's imposing a current at the left end. Okay, and then at the right end, of course, you have a fixed temperature. Okay, and in this case, of course, it's a stochastic model. You don't expect any periodic spatial breather, this sort of traveling wave mode. So this is the nonlinear wave mode. It's not observed in this system. Okay, so so let me also talk of some earlier work on this kind of boundary-driven anharmonic chains. So this is old paper where they looked at energy transmission in a nonlinear chain, but these are typically in the gap of the system, okay, not in the band of the harmonic chain. And here again, they observe some interesting transitions. This is another paper again where the driving frequency is outside the band. And here again, there was a very interesting transition where, okay, so here what happens as you increase the driving frequency, initially it's in a non-conducting phase, and then suddenly it goes into a conducting phase as you increase the driving force. And what they also observed is in that non-conducting phase, actually the system can be in two possible attractors. Okay, so in some parameter regime, they found that it can exist in two attractors. One is insulating, one conducting. Okay, so now here the difference was that they're always looking at, so this, they call it supra-transmission in the sense that it's outside, always occurs outside the band. Okay, so in the present work, and it's, I mean, we're right now writing up this, so it's not still there in the archive. So the main questions we want to look at is try to understand this periodic solution that Prem et al. Found in some more detail. In particular, we wanted to look at the stability of this solution. And then we also wanted to see what happens. So like I mentioned, in their work, there was no noise. So natural question is what happens if you add a bit of noise, or do this sort of very periodic solutions, do they still survive? And then we wanted to see what happens in this Hamiltonian model if you do this kind of slightly different driving, right? And can you again get a complete description in terms of effective diffusion equations? Okay, so so let me just first. Okay, so one of the things that we observe is that if you look at these effective equations where you ignore the higher harmonics, so these are the equations for the amplitudes of at each site. AIs are the amplitudes, and you can solve these equations numerically, and this is what you observe. So now, if you compare this with what the actual equations give, you find that in the bulk they agree completely, while in the boundary, what we find is that the higher harmonics are very quite significant. Okay, so I mean, this here it doesn't really match what you get from the exact solution. And this is the phases. These are the amplitudes. Okay, so this is the solution R. I'm plotting R as a function of sites, and this is there's a phase delta which is plotted here. Okay, so this is again looking at the frequency dependence of this phenomena. So as you increase the frequency, you find that this regime goes down and the transition points also change. At low frequencies, it survives for a much longer regime. Okay, so now this is our sort of, I would say the most interesting new result. What we find is that, okay, so this was the earlier observation that you get a transition at this point. Now, so when do you see this curve? Okay, so if you start from random initial conditions and then just run the dynamics for a long time, then this is what you would observe. Okay, but now if you actually start your initial conditions from somewhere close to this traveling wave solution, then what we find is that it can stay in this. It can continue to stay in this mode. So this, I mean, so in fact, in this regime, force regime, there are actually two solutions. Okay, so there are two attractors. One is a periodic attractor, and this is a chaotic attractor. Okay, so so that's the sort of first interesting result. And here you can do a sort of try to, once you're in this periodic attractor, you can ask like, what is the size of the basin of attraction? So you can put a perturbation and see if it returns to the basin, right? So this is what we do. I mean, so we ask what is the size of the perturbation needed to take you out of the basin of attraction. And we find that, so this is forces beyond this 10.5. So 10.5 is the transition, and here you have two attractors. So in this range, let's say 10 to around 34, it's a huge range. We find that actually it is quite stable even for significant perturbations. Okay, and we don't actually see this. So you can see this is, I mean, even here it's quite, it stays finite. So it looks like the basin of attraction doesn't really shrink. It stays finite for, I mean, yeah, so it looks like it can possibly, it's indefinitely stable. Yeah. As you increase n, okay, that's something we have not studied. Okay, so this is for n equal to 500. Yeah, that's an interesting question, which I think we haven't studied. I don't know if Umesh, did you study this? I don't know. No. Okay. Right. Yeah. So this is something we still need to do. Okay. Okay. So so the second thing we wanted to look at is what if you add noise here? Does it stay? So this is, you just add these terms at both ends. And then this is at various temperatures. So both ends are at the same temperature, and you look at different temperatures. So as you can see, at if you put a small temperature, it pretty much survives. Okay. So and then at higher temperatures, of course, you lose the transition, and it looks like usual stuff. But at least still some temperature, this plateau survives. Okay, and then we can also test kind of the stability. So here what we do is, let's say you start from the 0 temperature plot. So you have some initial condition here, and now you just switch on the temperature. Okay, so then you find that you just go to this steady state. And here, of course, we know that this can continue forever. And then, so at any point, if you switch on the temperature, you will just go to this state. Okay. So this is at t equal to 0.1. So if you start from random initial conditions, what you would get is something like this. But if you like start from close to the breather and switch on the temperature, then you will go to a different state. Okay. So it means that even at a finite temperature, there are, with noise and everything, it looks like there are two steady states. One sort of this state, and this is the other state which carries much more current. Okay, so here I show at finite temperature, what do the temperature profiles look like. So let's say this is at temperature 0.1, the plots at various frequencies, and let's say we look at this particular case where this is at omega equal to 1.5. And supposing we ask, so there you can see there are three regimes, this regime, the flat regime, and then this is the other regime, right? So if you look somewhere here, if you ask what does the temperature profile look like, then you get something like this. So this is a small force F equal to 1. And you get this kind of smooth temperature profiles. So at 1.5, I think this is the profile, and right, yeah. At F equal to 4, somewhere deep in this plateau, you find this sort of very flat temperature profiles, because they are temperature basically means it's periodic oscillations, right? Each particle is just oscillating periodically. And there's a phase, just some phase difference. Okay, so you find a completely flat temperature profile. I mean, you shouldn't really call it temperature, because there are no fluctuations. It's just the mean value amplitude square. Okay, and then if you go to somewhere here, then you find this kind of profiles. So this I already said, even though you are in the Fourier regime, but you get these very strange profiles which are not consistent with diffusion equation. Okay, so even at finite temperatures, you pretty much see what you saw at zero noise. Okay, so now I still have 5 minutes. Okay, so yeah, so now let me talk about this other other boundary condition that was studied in this paper. So I mean, if you remember, this paper studied the stochastic model, and the difference was that at the first end there's no dissipation. And at the far end, there's a heat bath, okay, at some finite temperature. Okay, so we study now with the Hamiltonian dynamics in the bulk and the same boundary conditions. Okay, so naively now, what would one expect, right? So if you have, I mean, if you are driving at one end, but now there's no dissipation, it looks like, okay, so one question is, do you still get the breather mode? Okay, so it's not clear. I mean, of course, if you can ask what happens if you didn't have this scaling. In that case, it would appear that since there's no dissipation, the effect of the drive should be stronger, and one might expect that you should still get this nonlinear wave mode. Okay, so this is what we'll try to examine. So now here what we find is that if you do this sort of scaling, the force scales as 1 by square root n, then you do get Fourier's law, and the temperature profiles don't have this flat regime anymore. So there are no traveling wave solutions. You get, so this is with increasing system size. At small system size, you see these big jumps, but at large system size, the profile is kind of smooth. And now you might ask, can this profile be reproduced by just the diffusion equation? Okay. So of course here, writing the diffusion equation is difficult because we don't really know the thermal conductivity of the Klein-Gordon chain as a function of temperature. But what you can do is you can you can do another simulation with basically no driving, no external driving, but just let's say heat baths at the two ends with these temperatures. Okay, and you can ask, does the temperature profile actually follow these plots? Okay, so this is what we did, and what we find is that indeed it does. So here for these 3 different system sizes, what you see is the profiles produced by the periodic driving and the profiles produced by no driving, but just thermal baths at different temperatures. Okay, so you can see that this is consistent with just diffusion equation. Okay, so the interesting points in this model are the effective temperature at both ends seem to converge to a limiting value, and they're consistent with effective thermal baths, just applying effective thermal baths at the 2 ends, and there are no signatures of this resonant wave mode. So somehow to get the resonant wave mode, it's really important to have both drive and dissipation at the left end. Okay, and okay, so the other question that one might think about is what happens if I didn't put this square root n factor. In that case, what you find is that you still get Fourier's law. The current eventually goes as 1 over n. So n times j saturates to a constant value. And but in this case, you find that as you take longer and longer chains, the system kind of heats up at the left end. Okay, so the effective temperature keeps going up. It doesn't really saturate to some constant value. So to see the saturation, you need is 1 by square root n scaling, which is the motivation which really, and one can argue actually why it should be 1 by square root n. So basically the argument is that roughly the current is maybe f square times omega square, and then we want this to scale as 1 by n. So then you get f should go as 1 by root n. Right. So okay. So right. So in this case, we find okay. So this theoretically one expects that this should scale as square root n, but we find that the temperature out here somehow scales as n to the power. Sorry, this should be n to the power a, where a is 0.75. And again, these temperature profiles are completely consistent with just putting thermal baths at the 2 ends. So again, there are no Brether modes in this situation. Okay, so I think I finished well in time. Okay, so the summary is so this is an interesting system where you have a driven dissipative chain. And I think it's interesting that this is sort of like most people, when people talk of periodically driven systems, usually drive at everywhere. But here it's a slightly different setup where you drive is only at one end, in which allows one to get a sort of current carrying steady state. Okay, so so we see that there are these multiple attractors in this chain, one periodic and a chaotic attractor coexisting. Now, this is actually, if you think about it, it's very similar to what you see in the Duffing oscillator, which is one of the simplest examples of a system with chaos, which is just this equation. Okay, so in this system, there are parameter regimes where you see only periodic solutions or just chaotic solutions, and there are also parameter regimes where you have they coexist. Okay, so now actually, if I mean, this model is itself, I mean, extremely rich. Okay, and you can find all sorts of crazy things in just this single particle driven dissipative system. So it's possible that this many body system with a similar drive and dissipative can have. I mean, there could be a lot of hidden interesting stuff still. Okay, and then we looked at that this nonlinear wave seems to survive noise, and in this case, it's a stochastic system which has a probability distribution. So, and then the question is like, how to come you get this non-equilibrium steady states? So that's interesting. And then we looked at a model with slightly different boundary conditions, which is this setup of these people. And here we find that the results are very similar to what one finds for the stochastic model. And there's an effective description by diffusion equation. Okay, for this case, there's no effective description by the diffusion equation, but for this, just with a slight difference in boundary conditions here, one is able to understand things much better. So and the role of boundary conditions is really crucial in this system. some interesting questions are, of course, the analytic solution to understand this nonlinear wave solution, and if you can understand these transition points and so on. And then with noise, at least you can write a Fokker-Planck operator, and one can think of a Floquet type of analysis. The other and very interesting question, I think, is we started with the quantum system, like it was this Bose-Hubbard model. I mean, what are the analogs of this these attractors in these quantum systems? Okay, so I mean, I was talking with someone and says it looked like maybe there are connections with Floquet quantum scars, but that's just wild speculation. Okay, so I think that's all. Thanks.
Questions?
Thank you. Can you tell first, in this model, which you discussed mainly with your own results, what is the bandwidth of the harmonic system relative to the band gap?
Yeah, so the bandwidth is, I think it goes from like square root 2 to, I mean, for the parameters that we're using. So it's this k0 plus 2.
Just in terms of numbers, how?
Oh, numbers, right. It's square root 2 to square root of 5.
So which is which? Square root of 2 is what?
1 point.
Is that the gap or the bandwidth?
Sorry, this is the bandwidth.
Oh,
so
see,
the
okay.
root 2 to.
So why I'm asking is because this nonlinear wave which you observe,
yeah,
and which seems to be an exact solution of this rotating wave approximation discrete nonlinear Schrödinger equation case, is of course maybe not exact in the original Hamiltonian.
Is not exact.
It's not exact.
Right,
Because, yeah. So and one thing which will happen is that you will generate higher harmonics.
Yeah.
So now if you take the driving frequency closer to the bottom of that band, and if 3 times the driving frequency can fall also into the band, because 2 is forbidden because of parity, then maybe you will see some interesting effect of disturbances of these nonlinear waves. Did you check that?
Okay, so you're saying put the driving frequency here and the
if
the
3 times
this
if 3 times
also...
that is still in, yes.
Okay.
But it doesn't look like that, right? Because 3 times square root of 2 is probably larger than
larger than, yeah, it will go outside.
I see.
Right, yeah.
So you could vary the gap to bandwidth ratio and then maybe see something.
Oh, okay, to vary there so that it still falls within the, and then, okay, right, yeah.
Which will lead maybe to a breakdown of this.
It should lead to a breakdown of the traveling.
Maybe.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Another question is, what were the initial conditions? So when you do observe this nonlinear wave steady state, what were the initial conditions in the bulk?
Okay, so see, for the blue curve, you start with random initial conditions and you go to either this or this.
So it's random, it's some non-zero finite temperature, so to say.
Yeah, I mean,
finite energy density
Right,
distribution.
yeah. Okay. Right, yeah. And but for this, we always start close to this and just increase the force. So we start close to the solution.
Thank you.
So this frequency dependence of the plateau region, and it seemed to get smaller as you increase the frequency.
Right, yeah.
And is there some sort of intuition for why this is happening, that the regions become much smaller?
No, okay, so yeah, so as you increase the frequency, you're going to this end. So here you expect it to disappear. But why exactly? So we don't have any idea of these transition points, like how they depend. So yeah, we don't really have, I mean, you do expect it to kind of go away, but other than that, yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's thank Abhishek again.